Right. Hello and welcome to the first case study that is distributed remotely during Services Week 2020. So we just kicked off Services Week at 10 o'clock this morning, and now we have the first case study that will be one of 5 because we continue those throughout the week. For those of you who just randomly ran into this session, you can learn all about Services Week and how you participate in it on the Government Digital Service blog. Is a blog post published last week that has this title, Participate in Services Week. So if you just look for that on a search engine close to you, you can read all about Services Week. And in there, you will find a link that leads you to the open schedule. On that open schedule, we have, at least this morning, it was 81 listed different events. So you can see these various categories. So various sessions are accessible remotely. Last time we counted about 20. And there are things in all parts of the country. So have a look at the open schedule. You can find it behind this link, bit.ly/SW agenda. bit.ly SW agenda. It's case sensitive, so please type it this way. This will directly lead you to the schedule. And this is where I'm going to stop talking. So please welcome Nick Ward. He is a lead service designer at Essex County Council, and he's going to talk about using service patterns to change the conversation in local government. So please welcome Nick. He's going to take over from here, and I'm really excited about this. So, Nick.
Hello. Good afternoon. I'm just going to share my screen here. Okay. So yeah, I'm also excited about this. I'm glad to hear that you are, Martin, and thanks for listening, everybody. Yeah, I'll just start by introducing myself. My name is Nick Ward. Martin's done a good introduction here, but I felt that it was only fair that, as well as introducing myself, I gave a quick shout out to our team of patternistas who've been doing this work within the service design team at Essex County Council over the past year or so. So we've been building a service design capability in the organisation over the last couple of years, and we're bringing together a lot of digital and kind of user-centred professions in the organisation, trying to kind of develop and embed a more user-centered approach across the way that we design and deliver services across the organisation. So it's a long-term endeavour for Essex County Council. We're relatively young in our development as a team, and within the context of the service patterns work that I'm going to talk about today, we've done kind of 2 phases of work on this so far. So what you're going to be seeing today is the kind of the output from around about 6 months' work that we've done in last year. During today's session, I'm going to talk for around about half an hour, and I'd like to cover 3 areas here. So first, I'm going to talk a little bit about Essex County Council and why we started to explore common service patterns as an approach here. I'm going to talk a little bit about what we've done so far and some detail about how we did it, because these are the questions we get asked quite regularly when we talk to other peers across the sector about our work with patterns. And then I'm going to finally just reflect on some of the things that we're learning and our kind of next steps for this work. So I hope that's going to be interesting for you. So first, why? And I should start with a little bit of context for those of you who aren't overly familiar with local government in the UK. Local government in Essex is complicated, and I think everyone has their own complexities in their own localities from there. Essex's big complication, if you like, is our scale. So we are the 2nd largest local authority. We're home to 1.4 million people that we serve. As in a comparison, your average kind of London borough would maybe serve 300,000 people, and a city like Birmingham would serve 1.1 million people. So we serve a lot of people, and we have some real pockets of variation across the council. So across the county of Essex, we have some real areas of wealth, some real areas of deprivation, we have some areas of urban centre, and we have some areas of rurality. So it's always difficult to think about all of the various different permutations and variations that we see across the county. So we're also a two-tiered local authority, which means as a county council, we serve the whole of Essex, which is pretty much the map that's on screen at the moment, except for two of the little blocks down the bottom for Thurrock and Southend, who are unitaries. So we work closely with district councils like Uttlesford, Braintree, that you can see on the map there. We have 12 district councils that we work closely with to deliver services. So in a two-tiered authority, that means that sometimes we'll only deliver part of a service. So something like waste is a really simple example. So the district councils that you see on your screen here, like Uttlesford and Braintree, will be responsible for collecting the curbside collections, so collecting the bins. They'll then take that to a waste transfer station, and then it becomes Essex County Council's responsibility to bring together all of that waste across the county and to then manage the bulk disposal of that waste. So that's a simple example around two-tiered government and some of the thinking that we have to do on that. There's other examples around adult social care services and things like housing, where we work very closely together. And I'm kind of just making that point to just add a bit of context to what we're going to talk about on our patterns work. It just means that we have to work really, really hard to think about how we provision information and signposting and advice to people in a way that can help them to navigate what can be quite a complex landscape. So we kind of don't want our complex tiered government to get in the way of people achieving their goals. So that's a lot of the thinking that we have to do a lot of the time. So as a council, over the past 10 years, we've been under the same pressure as a lot of other local authorities. So there's been significant cuts to funding, and demand is going up for a lot of the services that we deliver as well. The byproduct of pressure and demand is that we have done quite a lot of work on transformation over the past few years organisationally, but almost all of that work has been focused on organisational restructures and making services more efficient. An unfortunate byproduct of that kind of focus on restructure and on individual service improvement is that the map that people recognise the most in the organisation at the moment is the structure chart. People are very focused on their own functions and their own services, and that's broadly okay, but obviously as we start to continue to manage the challenges of the modern age, and funding is still under pressure and demand is still going up, we need to think of slightly smarter ways to be able to provision the right information and the right services in a way that can meet the needs of people in Essex from there. So one of our kind of drivers for doing work around common service pattern was to try and create a new map for the organisation, something that was grounded in the needs of users rather than in the needs of the organisation, and something that reflected people's actual experience when they interact with government rather than maybe our individual focus on individual services and silos around the organisation. So within our first phase of work, there's a few things that we needed to do and a few things that we wanted to do. So we needed to get people thinking beyond the edges of their services and silos, and we needed to help teams to recognise that we often do things in very similar ways, or we do similar things across the council, but we often do them in quite different ways. So something about calling out that duplication and helping people to identify that. And we also needed to help teams to understand how doing things more consistently across the organisation can be much better for the end user and the end user's experience, and can also be generally cheaper for the organisation to kind of build and maintain as we start to develop more and more services. So there was a couple of things that we wanted to do as well. So we wanted to change the conversation to kind of focus on that user experience and put the user at the heart of all the work that we do. We wanted to show what good looks like for modern public services in the internet age. So we wanted to be able to kind of articulate a journey or a vision, if you like, for what a really good service interaction looks like in the internet age, and give teams something that they could aspire to, a kind of a standard, if you like, that we could all work towards across all of our diverse teams in the organisation. And finally, we wanted to explore whether service patterns might be useful for offline as well as online services. So I'll talk a little bit more about that when we start to look at the actual work that we've done. But we kind of had an initial hypothesis, if you like, that service patterns, whilst generally we think of those in the context of our online services, and we certainly have done within our early phases of work here, we'd like to remain open-minded to the fact that there may be some kind of standards that we can establish for service delivery that go beyond just online services and into the real world and the other channels that people use to access services. So a little bit of context and a little bit of our kind of ambition when we started the work. So now I'll talk a little bit about how we got started and some of the approach that we took to this work. So at the beginning, when we set out to look at service patterns, we didn't really have a clearly defined goal or endpoint that we wanted to get to. We understood that lots of people were doing work around service patterns. We understood implicitly the value in improving the user experience, making it easier to use for service users, making it more accessible and easier to test and develop. But we wanted to obviously explore exactly how a pattern-based approach might work for us here. So we started with some research and we looked around at various different examples of patterns and patterns libraries that have been published or have been done in Discovery. Notably, there was the gov.uk design system where there'd been quite a lot of work on patterns that were quite focused on the kind of user experience on a website, so kind of guiding people through services from there. Lots of really good solid work from there. But again, I think for us, we were trying to think about how we start a conversation with an organisation that's quite digitally immature, that has a real mixed bag of services that are delivered via a huge range of different technologies, and kind of we're an organisation where we're almost at ground zero with some of these conversations. So we wanted to think about patterns in terms of a kind of a best practice guide for people rather than a fields on a page thing that was very specific to digital services. We wanted to talk about how it might just help us think about good service delivery in the internet age, be a little bit more universal and a bit less detailed maybe. And within our work, we started off by kind of trying to frame the level that we would work out. And we thought an awful lot about levels. The poster on the right here is something that Ben Holliday from FutureGov, who's our strategic partner here that we work with very closely in the early phases of work here, drew this poster on the right-hand side of the screen here with a kind of a provocation for higher or lower. So on the left-hand side of the screen, you've got your kind of your service. So this might be the thing that you would recognize, the thing that someone is trying to do when they interact with the council. So take an example, maybe I want to register the birth of a child. So I want to register a birth from there. We know that if we look down this list below the service level, we know that there's sub-services. Now we have, when we talk about sub-services, we've kind of defined those as the various different channels and ways that people can access that service. So when I want to register my child, I may need to fill in some information online, but I may have to go and have a face-to-face appointment for that. I may be able to phone up and do some of that application via the phone, and I may have to actually make a payment again in person somewhere in there. So the sub-service level was really thinking about the component parts that make up that service. Below that, we kind of positioned our original thinking around the service patterns, so the regular repeated things that happen as part of those sub-services. And below that, again, the common technology components that kind of support those service patterns and those sub-services and those services. So this was kind of us setting out our stall for how we wanted to start to think about the breakdown of services in a more consistent way across the organisation. But probably more importantly from the early work that we did there was the levels that sit above those services. So we called out that these services are currently run within a function, within a kind of an organisational unit within the council itself, and it's important to recognise where that is right now on an as-is basis. But within increasingly, we started to think about the life events that those services sat within. So registering a birth is a really good example of something that happens alongside lots of other things that I might be doing at that time in my life. So I may be engaging with all manner of health services around my newborn child. I may be looking at the potential for finding childcare so that I can kind of get back to work, or you know, my circumstances might have changed, so I might be looking around for any number of different types of support. So all of those things at the moment are run generally as different services, and a lot of them are housed in different functions around the organisation. So we thought maybe it would be interesting to kind of look at those life events and see what they would tell us about how we group and organise services as part of this work. And then finally, at the very highest level, we realised that everything has to have a place context. So we know that registering a birth in Essex is probably different to registering a birth on one of our neighbouring counties. And across the country, there's lots of organisations have responded to the statutory duty to deliver this service in a different way. So the place contacts is really important. I may be moving into Essex for the first time, in which case there may be a real kind of basket of things that I have to do at once. I may be looking to start a business in Essex, and there will be some specific requirements there that I'll need to think about. So we spent a lot of time up front just kind of thinking about how we might start to capture and collate information across the organisations to work out what value patterns might give us. And regularly, when we were getting bogged down in the detail in our work, we kind of, we looked at the poster and we said, no, higher. We need to get up and out of the weeds a little bit and think about the context a bit more. And then if we were thinking about the context too much and we weren't getting to the detail, then we'd go lower and we'd kind of get into some more of the detail around the services. So this set our stall out and gave us a kind of an approach that we would use during the mapping of our services. And then we set out to map services. So we wanted to create effectively an Essex-based data set from which to then continue to build our patterns approach. So we know that patterns, as I mentioned earlier, are being used in a lot of other areas, in a lot of other contexts, but we really wanted to ground this in the current organisation that people would recognise, so that we could really start to have those different conversations around doing things more consistently across the organisation. So we started by limiting ourselves a little bit. Essex County Council was responsible for thousands of services in many different permutations, and it would have just been too much for us at the start to try and cover all of those. So we focused on resident-facing transactional services that generally surface through the Essex County Council website. So I mentioned earlier that our ambition here is to look beyond that, but in the first instance, while we were exploring this approach and really starting to understand how it might have a value here, we sort of purposely restrained the scope to online transactional services that face residents. And what I'm going to talk about now is how we captured an as-is picture of what the organisation currently does. There's a recognition that this is never going to be perfect, and this is an iterative approach. So it was really about creating that initial data set so that we could then start to build our approach going forwards. So we started mapping services. The process we took with that is that we literally followed journeys through the Essex County Council website, and we captured a key set of information that we could then use as our base data set. So I'm going to quickly step through what we captured because we get asked about this a lot. So hopefully this will be interesting for you. So we started by capturing the name of the service. Really important, obviously, to do that in a language that users would recognise. Again, even something as small as that, using a kind of a user-centred description for our services is really useful for helping to kind of just have an interesting conversation around the organisation as to why we might be describing things slightly differently. We then talked about subservice a minute ago. So within subservices, there's various different ways through. So for the registering a birth service here, you could book an appointment via an online form or book an appointment over the phone and then pay in person. We looked at the role of the council. So as I mentioned earlier, we are a two-tiered authority, so we directly deliver some services, but there are other services where we may have a mixed model of delivery, so we'll only deliver part of that service. There are some services that we commission out and that are externally delivered, and there's some services that we just signpost people to. So it felt important as we were going through this and looking through these mappings that we could clearly articulate the kind of the role of the council in that, so that would help us with our thinking going forwards. Level of authentication. We use this really as a measure of complexity. So we just captured on a very simple 3-point scale whether the service needed to collect any personal information. So if there was no information required, if it was just a straightforward transaction from there, we weren't capturing anything, then we put that down as level 1. If there was some personal information captured, so you had to give some details in order to be able to find what you were looking for, then we called that level 2. And if you needed to sign up for an account and fully authenticate yourself, then we called that level 3. And we really just use that as a measure of the levels of complexity that might sit underneath the service in terms of the technology and the privacy and things that we might think of from there. We then moved on to tech components. So as we were going through the journey, we started to recognize where there were tech components that were supporting parts of journeys. So we sort of captured the name of those to kind of pull that together alongside the service detail. And then we pulled together data where we could to kind of validate the current service experience or to give us some idea of the demand for these services. So we had volume data that came from our contact center and some work that we'd done there. We also had some Google Analytics data from web journeys as well, which was quite useful. And then we captured some pain points. So this was stuff that we heard about from the services that were running their services, from the contact center, where we were speaking to agents who handled calls from residents around this, and also from our own experience about going through service journeys from there. So we started to capture those just so we had some kind of indication of how that service was currently performing and where the opportunities might be around that. And finally, the life event link, which I spoke about earlier. So it was really useful for us to be able to identify a slightly different lens to put over a number of these different journeys. As we started to build up a collection of 150 services, it enabled us to kind of cut that data in a different way and view that slightly differently. And these are just some examples of the life events that we started to capture. These originally come from a list of life events that was created from the Local Government Association. And we think this is a really interesting angle to think about how we might provision information in more coherent ways in the future. So I think from our early work around the mapping, this felt like a really exciting area for us to go further with. So we're doing much more testing around life events now and thinking about how we might use that to reformat some of the navigation on the website and to think about how we provision that information differently. So this was mapping that we did over a period of about a month. So it was quite an intense period of work for a team of 3 people, not working on it full time, but working on it a fair amount of time. So we went through and we followed those journeys through, and that gave us a really useful data set that spanned the whole organization and was nicely balanced between the high level contextual info that we'd need and some of that more detailed stuff that might help us to understand where the real opportunities were and where we might go forwards. And from our list of 150 services, we created a list of the common things that were being done across those service journeys. And I don't think there'll be any surprises here. I think you'll recognize these as things that you do on your daily lives. But again, we derived these patterns and we could link these directly back to Essex County Council services. So we thought within this there was something quite compelling in the narrative here that just enabled us to be able to then start to have some slightly different conversations. And one of the really good tools that we created that enabled us to kind of think about things differently were these summaries by pattern. So this is just an example of our book something pattern. So for the first time, we'd be able to show on a fairly non-technical basis how many times bookings were being taken across council services. So from 150 services, we saw that there were 35 different services taking bookings. And those services were across 5 different functional areas. And whilst it's not on this slide, we know that there were actually 5 different technology solutions in use as well for those 35 different booking journeys. And so we can also see from this this kind of dashboard there that this is a pattern that appears in a lot of the journeys that people are calling into our contact center. So we know that there is some unmet demand here around patterns that have a booking element to them. People are calling the contact center, which may show that there is something in that booking journey that's not optimized at the moment. And so this was a really interesting moment for us. So this is where we could kind of put this in front of services and said, yes, we know you're looking at a booking solution, but did you know there's another 35 of these across the organization? And it really gave a lot of our services, or it's continuing to give our services some kind of light bulb moments, really, when they realize then. I mean, it's kind of hard to argue that if you're doing things 35 times in 5 different technologies and in potentially 30 different ways, clearly that's not necessarily going to be efficient for the organization to build and maintain. And also it's going to result in a really mixed user experience for people who are trying to go across those services. Now, people may not use all of the services, they may only use one service, but if we can really create a best practice for this type of transaction and we can help services to understand how they move towards that, that would have a real value. So these summaries were really useful for us. And then we started to think about what we could do with this information and what our output would be from this work. So as well as a map and a summary across the organization, we wanted to create some kind of guidance that we could use as a design team when we're working with services, to be able to help them to understand what good looks like and what the future evolution of their service might look like. And we also wanted to create something that would perhaps be use to services themselves, so they could just reflect on what was working well in their service or not, and they could maybe do their own kind of continuous improvement journey as well. So having a set of standards and guidance just felt like a really valuable thing. So we started to work about what we'd include in that guidance from there. So we thought it would be useful to show when a pattern might be the best to use that, when it might be best not to use it, kind of interdependencies with other types of patterns that we had, any case studies and related research. And we were hoping that our guidance and our library at this stage would help people make good decisions about their services, and they may be able to then really help to understand what type of problem using a patterns-based approach might help them solve. So this was our initial hypothesis when we started the work. And then we developed some design workshops. So this was done primarily in the team. We invited some stakeholders from across the organisation into these sessions as well. But basically what we did at this stage was we took each of those patterns, we took the journeys that sat under each of those patterns, and we followed the journey again, similar to what we'd done with the mapping, but in a little bit more detail. So we went through, we followed the journey, and we really focused in on the pain points, the things that were working well and the things that weren't working well. So we kind of captured those pain points and those opportunity areas. And then we ran ideation sessions across the team where we all brought together our observations and we started to ask ourselves, what would a good journey look like? So if we were going through a journey where there was an application and we were finding that it wasn't being clearly communicated to us how long that application was going to take or how long it would take for us to get a response after we'd been through the journey, then we wanted to kind of raise that as the best practice. So this is what we expected. This is what wasn't there. This is what we'd be aiming for. So we went through as a team and we kind of cooked up what we considered to be modern good practice around this. And then we turned that into some key questions and prompts that you might ask when you're actually designing a journey for someone. So the patterns in themselves are really a set of guidance that are contextual and related to a particular thing that a user is trying to do. And it's a selection of prompts and suggestions for how you can do that thing as well as possible. And I'll show you some examples of that in a second. Another important thing just to talk about here is that whilst we were talking about patterns with 7 top-level patterns, so things like book something, check something, as we were doing this process of kind of working into those journeys and working out what they really meant and what a good user experience would be, we started to unpack them into some slightly more detailed scenarios. So checking something comes in a range of different types of things that people are trying to achieve. So some people might want to check something before they apply. And that journey will be fundamentally different to checking whether there's a risk of something happening to me. And that could be, again, potentially quite different to someone who's checking where their nearest thing is from there. So as well as having our 7 top-level patterns, through these workshops and this design work that we'd done, we then broke out something like 30 different scenarios that sit under those 7 patterns. And this is our work in progress now, to work through all these different scenarios, to unpack journeys that are happening around the organisation, and to kind of show what we think a good user experience would be, and to create into a set of guidance that's useful for us as a design team and useful for services to reflect and look at the design of their own service. And this is what it looked like in its first iteration. So you won't be able to read this, I don't think. It's hard enough to read at this end when you zoom into it. So this is basically a journey map, effectively, that shows the steps that a user is taking across the top, what the flow would be through that service interaction, and then the prompts or the questions that we might ask underneath that. So this was our first iteration that we did as we were trying to unpack all of the information from our design workshops. So this is the check my nearest flow from there. But we fairly quickly realized that having it in this format, whilst it was intuitive to those who've built it, wasn't particularly user-friendly for anybody to use, as I'm sure you can attest to if you're trying to read it. So the latest iteration of this is a more text-based approach, and we've now shared this, the work that we've done to date on this, within our Essex design system that we use as a team to kind of to guide our practice at Essex County Council. And if I just jump out the presentation for a second here, I can just show you what that looks like at the moment. So this is our iterative patterns library. So on the top level here, we show an overview, we show some of that information around how you identify various service patterns, how you might map your service, and how you might create prototypes and work with these. If I go into the next level down here, you can see our long list of patterns. You can see the various different scenarios that we have, and you can see those that we've developed into guidance and those that are still to be developed. And so again, if I just jump in here to some of our guidance that we have developed. So for the check before you apply pattern, we've got something about making decisions. Yes.
I think everybody can still see the slide, but they can't see. But that doesn't. I think it doesn't matter.
Okay, no, that's fine. Don't worry. I'll jump back to the presentation.
Cool.
There's a link here. We can share this afterwards, Martin, so people can have a little look around and see that from there. So that's fine. So yeah, so basically, what started as a very visual map has now turned into some guidance that's more accessible, that's more easy to use, and we're continuing to work with this and iterate this as we develop the patterns going forwards there. So at the moment, we've completed 4 of these scenarios, and we have a list of, as I say, about 30 scenarios that we're working with now going forwards. So what we've now done, so we had the initial couple of phases of work where we were really focused on building an approach and building a methodology that we could use. And now we've sort of pivoted a little bit really. So whilst we were working horizontally and looking across the organization to draw out the common things, now as we start to develop the scenarios, we've sort of flipped to looking more vertically. So we're now looking for those opportunities where we can work with the service, and as we work with the service, we're building the guidance around what we learn with specific services, and then we're sort of looping back to that horizontal level to work out how we can bring together what we learn for each individual service in a way that we can then apply on a more generic basis across the organisation. And this will be the way that we continue with the work. We'll be kind of diving into individual services, unpacking the various different scenarios against a live service, against a piece of improvement work, and then bringing that guidance back to the library and looking at how we can apply that more broadly across the organisation. So that was kind of a quick journey through our patterns approach. Hopefully that was useful and wasn't too much information. It's quite hard to kind of compress it into a short presentation. And just I thought I'd end with a few reflections on what we're learning. So taking a kind of hypothesis-based approach has enabled us to quite quickly identify those common services and ground that in the organisation, which has been really useful. And it has already started to broker different conversations. So we know that different people around the organisation are really excited about where we could go with this. And as we bring patterns into conversations with services, we're seeing them being really grateful for having a clear articulation of what good looks like and what they can aspire to from there. And another reflection is that it can be quite slow. So at the start, we barreled through, we did a lot of mapping in a month, but when we start bumping into real services and the constraints of those, sometimes that work takes a while. So this is a long-term project for us, and we are open-minded to how we might collaborate with others on this as well. Whilst we've grounded the work in Essex County Council and our context here, we feel like the approach and the outputs that we have are fairly universal. So we're really open-minded as to where we might go in the future to help kind of get some economies of scale here. If the patterns work for us, maybe they'll work for everyone, so we can look at other future collaboration opportunities as well. And finally, just a couple of observations before I finish talking here. So an interesting observation here is that the conversation about common service patterns is landing really well with the leadership of the organisation and senior managers here. And actually technology suppliers have been quite welcoming where we've engaged them in conversations around this. But we are finding that for some individual service owners, they're less sort of motivated by the thought of common ways of doing things. They really only care about making their service as good as possible. So we've learned something interesting around how we frame the conversation. We don't necessarily make a big deal about service patterns when we go in to work with a new service. We kind of just use it as part of our tool set as a design team, and then we bring them into the thinking around patterns and best practice, and then we sort of hold that patterns work in the background while we're working with a service, and then we sort of iterate that from there as well. But that's kind of a really interesting observation. I think I was excited about patterns, the team was excited about patterns, we assumed everybody would be, not necessarily the case. And another observation, which is hard to ignore, is that services are dealing with lots of constraints, which do make it very difficult for them to adopt best practice in one hit. So I think, aspirationally, we know that the patterns can really help to improve lots of things around the service, but services don't generally get there in one great leap. It's about just having that best practice to point at, and as a tool for that purpose, it's proven to be really useful. I think I'm almost out of time here, so I'm going to kind of skip through this really, but we're supporting a channel shift program in Essex now. And as I mentioned earlier, we're kind of alternating between diving into services and building our patterns approach in the background from there. And we're going to continue to build the library and create new guidance as we go forwards. And then there's just some last reference slides here. So we have blogged quite extensively about our patterns work that we've done. And there's a link there to our service design blog where you can learn more detail about that. The patterns are now live, the ones that we've developed within the Essex design system, and there's a link to that there as well. And also it's worth calling out that we worked with FutureGov as our strategic partner on the earlier work that we did with service patterns. They share our ambition for making this a more collaborative approach, and they've actually published a patterns library for local government on their website as well, and they've invited a wider conversation around this. So there's lots of early thinking around collaboration here and how we can do more. I think we're in an interesting place now. We've done our first phase of development from now, and we're into a more kind of business as usual approach with this, but we're certainly open-minded as to what future opportunities might look like for more collaboration there. And I think that's me.
This is great. This is really amazing to see and to hear, and it's fantastic that you share all these links. So I have a few questions, but there's also a question. Let's read out the first one from NHSX. They were curious to hear what software did you use for the as is map.
Oh, okay, that's Airtable. So Airtable is it's kind of a cross between a spreadsheet and a database. So it's a cloud-hosted service, and it's a way of kind of just throwing data in as you would do on a spreadsheet, but making some kind of relational links between different tabs. So it's got some really good visual tools that you can use for filtering and creating new views on your data. So within our library on Airtable, we can cut it by pattern. We can cut it by scenario, we can cut it by the level of authentication. So any of those fields that I showed earlier around how we kind of capture that information, we can very quickly generate a view around that. So it just enables us to frame the data in a way that can be meaningful at any point. So it's been a really good tool for that. It's nothing that you can't do in Excel if you're an Excel whiz, but there's something much more intuitive about doing that in Airtable.
Nice.
And the maps were drawn in Miro.
Mm.
Our first maps that the big maps.
Big one. Nice.
Not very accessible.
Yeah, I was wondering, is there as well a way to do this in an open shareable format that works? For potentially other partners.
Sure, absolutely. I think we still feel like we're very much at the start of this journey in terms of developing the tools and the approach. So I think we've been iterating as we go here, learning what works, what doesn't work. I think we're really keen. I think the way we've been talking and thinking about service patterns is definitely a more universal language. So I think it's a lot of the previous work that we found in our research was very focused on digital interactions. So patterns that appear on web pages. I think we're talking more about service experiences here. So I would hope that in some ways that's quite universal, and certainly our guidance that we've created so far is available. We're really interested in feedback on that, and we're really interested in whether people think that would be of value to them, and if there's any way that we can collaborate on that, then we'd be really open-minded to it.
Mm-hmm. So please, if you have a question, leave it in the chat. I'll read it out. I think that works better than everybody unmuting themselves. So if you have a question, leave it there. And I'd be explicitly interested to hear from other people from other local authorities, but also other government organizations. That would be great. Oh, there's one question from John Edwards. He's asking, could you elaborate a little bit more on the team structure? That's a very good point.
Sure. So within the first phase of work, we had a service designer and a user researcher. And myself as lead service designer. So within that initial mapping, that was the work that we did, as a relatively small team of 3. For the second phase, which is where we then started to do the design workshops and work up the patterns guidance, we had a bit of a change in personnel. So we'd managed to recruit a couple of new team members at that point. So we used this as a bit of an onboarding exercise for new team members. So we, at that point, had myself, another service designer, and 2 user researchers working on it, but not the same people as worked on the first phase of work. We also still had some support from FutureGov for that second phase of work as well. So as I say, we used that as a bit of an onboarding exercise because we thought it was really useful to kind of familiarise people with the services that we offer here. So a really good opportunity to take people who were new to the organisation and really kind of ground them in the as-is of where our services are, and kind of then start their journey as designers at Essex with this really clear kind of set of guidance and best practice to take forwards. And I think we worked on it roughly 2 to 3 days a week throughout that period of around about 6 months.
Well, I have some questions, but let's have Ben first. Has the pattern library helped move towards common technology components, for example, a single booking platform, something like that?
Yeah, so this happened in parallel, actually. We didn't necessarily design it to be that way. So there was work that had already been started in our technology services team, which is separate. I know in some organisations, the kind of the digital and service design team sits with the technology team. At Essex, we are actually separate organisational units. So some work had been done to consolidate common components by our technology teams, and it landed at around about the same time as we landed the first phase of the patterns work. So we're having an ongoing conversation there at the moment. What our preferred platforms are going forwards, and there is a kind of a process that will take years to migrate towards those single platforms. What we're trying to do is to engage those suppliers in a conversation about patterns now, so that as we start to build more services into single platforms, we can start to have a more grown-up conversation about what those platforms can achieve and what the user experience is like. So we're trying to hit it in both ways, really. So from a technology level, trying to do that consolidation, but also trying to use this best practice as a standard for our teams and for our service suppliers to actually, and our technology suppliers to actually aspire to as well.
Great.
And we've had a pretty good response from suppliers, actually. They're interested. They're interested in understanding how we view best practice.
I mean, it makes sense from a business perspective, right? So
sure, yeah. I mean, you'd assume that that's going to, that if it's grounded in user research and user experience, that's going to improve their product as well.
Yeah, great. There's a question from Chris from Bristol, who wrote, I saw that you looked at the pattern library from Projects by If. How did this work you did enable you to better understand why and how to use personal data? That's a very good question.
That's a really good question, and I don't know that I could draw a direct link between that at the moment. So where I mentioned the levels of authentication earlier, we captured the levels of data that were currently being captured in our as-is services. As of yet, we haven't been focused to that level of detail on the actual information that's captured or the privacy elements of a service. At the moment, the patterns that we've developed out have been more looking at a more generalized user experience as it goes through. I don't think we've really focused in on the privacy elements and used the patterns as a lever for that. So I'm sorry if that's a disappointing answer, but yeah, no, it hasn't really been. I haven't got a really good example I can give you where we've linked that together in that way. It's kind of part of our original data capture, but it hasn't yet informed the work that we've done to a great degree.
I'd be curious to hear, how did you talked about 40 or so scenarios, and you said you have worked through 4. How did you prioritize that?
So we are now prioritising our work as to wider transformation plans that the organisation has. So we have a kind of a channel shift program that kicked off here and is going through all of our high demand services at the contact centre. So we are looking for opportunities where we can work with the service to do work we might have done anyway, and to kind of bring the patterns work into that thinking from there. So within the first, it's probably fair to say on the first few that we developed, we started with check something. because Check Something felt like probably the least technology driven of the patterns. So obviously bookings and payments and registrations bring quite a lot of complexity with them. So in the first instance, while we were setting out and really sort of starting to understand this approach, we didn't necessarily want to get too mired in that technology conversation, although there are still elements of technology in checking things as well. But so I think we probably picked off the easiest ones first, and then you'll have noticed again, if I just jump back to this, so we've recently got into applications, and that's because there's work going on around our forms solution internally. So it felt like a really pertinent time to kind of start to bring that patterns conversation in there. And book something. Again, one of our channel shift journeys is around bookings, and one of our common components is the booking system. So we had an opportunity to go there. So we're being a little bit opportunistic. We're looking for the right opportunities where we can do some meaningful work and kind of continue to build the patterns work alongside that.
Great. You earlier mentioned that you have quite good senior management buy-in and that the whole project landed really well. How did you get started? What were kind of the promises you made? What were the expectations described in the business case?
So I think, okay, I'm going to full confession now. We didn't have a business case for the first phase of work that we did here. So this was something that, as part of establishing our user-centered team here, we set out to kind of just do an initial couple of phases of work to kind of build this approach, almost as a kind of a toolkit for us to use when we talk about user-centered design. So it's a bit of a kind of a service design playbook a bit for the team really as we go through. So this was part of creating our new capability here rather than a specific transformation business case that we might create. So we look to add the value to other business cases with things like our channel shift program that obviously will have its own discrete business case. But yeah, so from a point of view of kind of selling this approach, we just really had the luxury of being able to kind of build that as part of building the team. Buying at a senior level has been relatively easy, although we get regular comments about the fact that people think this is easy. people are surprised that this isn't just how things are done, which shows maybe a slight lack of understanding of some of the complexities of doing things more consistently across such a varied and diverse organization. So yeah, it's not without its challenges, but yeah, it's generally when we talk about this and having some of those things like those summaries for each type of pattern really helps us to kind of land that. It's a bit of a no-brainer for people. It's a bit of a light bulb moment where they'll, where they can clearly see that it's not an efficient way of doing things in the in the modern age where more and more services are moving online. People kind of inherently understand that doing things consistently online has to be better. So the more kind of engagement piece that we have to do is when we start to work with a service, an individual service. And as I mentioned in some of our reflections earlier, we're finding actually talking about service patterns to individual services isn't really framing the conversation in that helpful a way. They just really want to understand how we make their service better. So the guidance that we have does that. The approach works for that. But yeah, maybe making a big deal about it being consistent and about it being a pattern isn't really the conversation that we need to have at that level. But this is all part of the learning around the work.
Right. So I'm curious to hear, what kind of conversations did you have with your peers from other local authorities who might have, as you described at the very beginning, a different setup? What did you hear from them once you shared that? Because I remember you have been presenting this work specifically as well at the local Gov Design Day in Birmingham a few weeks ago.
Sure. So I think we've been as open as we can during the work. It's fairly. Is it complicated? It's probably not complicated. I'm probably making it complicated. But so because we were building this as part of building our team and our practice at Essex, it was an important thing for us to do just for our team and for kind of establishing our approach and our playbook. So I think our mindset within the early phases here was that we would share what we were doing and that we would remain open to collaboration. But we haven't necessarily put this out there as a collaborative approach. So we haven't necessarily kind of put together a proposal to the wider sector to work with us on this in a formal way. I think we've had lots of interesting conversations with other organisations. A number of other local authorities are doing similar work in slightly different ways. We work quite closely with Stockport Metropolitan Borough Council on sharing some code bases and that sort of thing. They are looking at service patterns, and they're kind of, they're developing their own approach to that as well. We haven't yet had that conversation where we've immediately agreed that, that there's a common thing we can do here. But I think, as I said earlier, we're kind of open-minded to when that opportunity might arise. I think we've found a way of doing this now that we feel more confident about than we did at the start. So I think there is, a different conversation that we can maybe have around collaboration now. And certainly there's things like the initiatives that have been going on over the past 18 months or so from Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government. And I know that there was an original funding bid that went in there for creating a service patterns library. So I'd like to think that we can play a part in those discussions as we go forwards. So it hasn't been a formal collaboration opportunity. We haven't resourced this in a way that enables us to drive real collaboration. But basically, while we did the work, we shared as openly as we could, and we continue to do that. And I think when the right opportunity comes along to do that work, we'll be really glad to embrace it.
Mm-hmm. Lisa from Stockport just said she enjoyed sharing the journey. So I wonder, so if there's someone who's in here right now and thinking, "Ooh, I would be interested," or is watching the recording of this later, how do they get in touch?
Sure. So there's service design blogs there. If I have a Twitter, obviously, which I'll just bring up on the screen here as well, so they can get in touch with me, or my email address, which is nicholas.ward@essex.gov.uk, and we'd be very happy to hear. So the service design blog's a really good place to start. As I say, we've been as open as possible, so we've shared our journey there, and you can contact us through that blog as well. So.
Fabulous. Okay. I think that's it. If there are no more questions, if questions come up later, you can just reach out to Nick. So thank you very much for joining. And of course, Nick, thank you so much for presenting and sharing all your experiences and insights. That is fantastic.
No problem. You're most welcome.
Brilliant.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.